Welcome back, everybody, to week 5 of nuk218, Introduction to 3D Animation and Modeling for Compositors. In this class, we're going to begin building the main shot of the course. We kick off around 1:30, and you'll see we have one of my daughters here, Michaela, the only one that could stand still for the shoot. And what we're going to do is have her collapse like a bundle of cloth as we make that move upwards, and then have a bunch of particle effects fly off like her spirit kind of departing for the next life. And you'll see that the main shot starts around 125, 130. We have a bunch of leader here, which will just help with the tracking solve. What we also have is a clean plate pass. I'll play it back here. Obviously not exactly the same move, but we'll see during this class tonight how we can actually leverage this to clean plate the first shot. We'll actually replace the road in this shot here with the road here, but keep the camera move from this shot. Now, this is something you might be able to pull off with a planar track. The only problem is this road isn't a flat surface. It actually has a curvature to it, and so that would make it quite difficult to pull off as a planar track solve. So what we're going to do is actually align these two. Now, you may think you could actually create one match move track for the clean plate and another match move track for the hero shot. Unfortunately, that really is quite difficult. To actually get them to line up and to match with separate solves is really tricky. Instead, the best technique, if possible, is to find two frames that are really similar. In this case, I've lined up the hero plate here and the clean plate. You'll see the actual positions of the two cameras of these frames are really quite similar. We have a lot of features the same. If I set them up next to each other, you'll see there is a jump, but not so much that the tracker won't be able to treat that just as a sudden camera movement. And so what we'll do is we'll actually align these back to back and use them to solve the entire shot as if both camera moves took place in the same single move. So let's go about this. You can go ahead and load up the prep image sequence, and these are H.264 shots coming out of a Canon 7D. They have a flat exposure, as you can see, to give us plenty of room to play with the dynamic range when we go to relight the shot. And what we'll do is first line up the sequence. Now, I want the first frames to line up because that's where they have the best frame matches. Frame 1 of the clean plate, frame 2 of the hero plate. Unfortunately, they're not going to do that unless the clean plate's playing backwards, because that's the first frame. I want it to butt up against the first frame of the hero plate. But if it's playing backwards, we won't be able to actually get the clean plate moving the way we want it. So the solution is we'll double click the clean plate, and in the read properties, we're going to change the back end from hold to bounce. That means it's going to play forward from 1 to 325, and then it will play backwards from 326 back to 1. So now that we've set that up, we now need to double the range. So instead of this playing from 1 to 325, it's now going to play from 1 to 650, which means the hero shot, we need to change that to start at 650. And we'll add a switch node. And in our switch node, we will set at 649. Where am I? 649. We'll set it to be clean plate shot. And 650, we'll set it to be our hero shot. And there we have it. And let's just confirm I got the shot numbers right. 650, 649. The freeze frame, the clean plate, looks like we're good. Going backwards again. Okay, so we have the switch taking place there, and that effectively combines our two clips. And now, just to line everything up, we actually don't want to have all of this extra room at the beginning. That's kind of unnecessary. The actual camera move in the clean plate of the camera moving up to mimic the move of the hero shot starts right around frame 130. So let's just add a time offset here and set it to minus 130, which will push the whole lot back so that the shot starts there at frame 1 and concludes at now 130 less than 890, which is 760, I believe, if my math is correct. There we go. All right, so let's write this out, and we will just create a new directory, nuke media, we'll say full sequence, give the folder that name, and then actually give the sequence that name, .pound.exr, save, and we'll just let this render out. If you want the maximum speed possible, you can set compression to none. If you're concerned about your disk space, you can leave it at scanline. All we care about is the RGB. I'm using 16-bit half just to make sure that I don't lose any dynamic range, which I shouldn't, but we'll leave it there. And I'm going to render, and I want to fix this render range to 12760. And click OK. With the render complete, let's bring in the rendered sequence. And the first thing we'll do is throw in a grade. I'll disable it, and we'll sample black and white points. White point from the fence here. Black point from over here. And now we'll just tweak that with a bit of contrast. Disable again or re-enable. And we'll just pop these up. Crank the black and the white points. And then pull the gamma. That should give us something to work with. All right. Now, the first thing you'll see is because we combine the two shots, we do have that jump point. And that is at frame 519 to 520. In fact, just to remind us, we'll add a sticky note, jump to 520. And as a result, the girl doesn't exist for the first part of the sequence, but she does for the last part, which is the part we care about for the actual shot. So what we should do is remove her, because as much as she's standing still, her hair is moving, her dress is blowing in the breeze, and we don't want that to confuse the tracker. So let's add a planar tracker to the shot, and we'll simply move to a frame where she's fully visible. Create a shape. Now we want to use her feet as an anchor, so we're not going to include her feet in the planar track. There we go, and let's just track this through. Pop back to the start of the render and track back the other way. You should find the tracker fails right at 520 to 519, which is to be expected because Michaela disappears off screen. So just to make sure everything's right there and we don't have any problems with false positives, false areas of track, let's go ahead and set the opacity to 100% at 520 and 0 at 519 for this Bezier. So now we should find that if we look at the alpha channel, her matte appears at 520 and doesn't show up prior to that, so we won't get any false areas of occluded tracking for the tracker. If you got lost somewhere in that last section, go ahead and load up Lens Distortion version 1 from this week's project files. The only thing to take note of is that I didn't include the full sequence.exr in the download because you made that from the MOVs. So if you haven't already done that, go ahead and kick off the render in the right node there, and then you should be able to read this in without having any link errors. All right, the first thing we're going to do this week is handle lens distortion. So we want to do a complete solve here, and that requires removing distortion from the shot so that we can get a fairly accurate track of the entire sequence. There are several ways to remove lens distortion. I'm just going to go ahead and add a lens distortion node, and you'll see you actually have three modes. You have image analysis, grid analysis, and line analysis. Grid analysis is useful when you have a checkerboard grid already shot of the lens distortion. Now, just bear in mind that if you're not working with a prime lens, if you have a zoom lens, the lens distortion will be dependent on the actual zoom. So if you zoomed to 17, it's going to be different from the lens zoom to 50. So make sure that you're working with the same zoom lens distortion grid to match the actual zoom that you're at when you were shooting. So we could use a checkerboard, and in fact I do have a checkerboard here. Unfortunately, this was not a very conventional checkerboard. As you can see, it was simply some grid paper that I had handy, and so the checkerboard isn't going to work. The other option is to take the footage and use image analysis, which will use optical flow algorithms to track the footage, and basically from all the vectors it tracks, it will attempt to work out what the distortion is as things move off to the edge of frame, how they get distorted. The other one that's quite handy is line analysis, and that works really well when you have some nice geometry in your scene. In the case of our footage, we have some things like the painted lines on the road, but there's no real guarantee that they were painted accurately. Likewise, the fences at the back are not particularly geometric. Even these poles here might be bowed. So while they're somewhat useful, we don't really have enough geometry in this scene to really make line analysis worthwhile. So we could do an image analysis and just let it track the scene. However, because we have the grid, we can actually use line analysis to solve for the grid. And I'll show you how to do that, and then I'll cheat and use the one I prepared earlier. And all you do is you set to your tab to line analysis, click on drawing mode, and start clicking along lines of geometry with left clicks. You just make several clicks to create multiple points where this thing can bend. And after you've done your last one, click away and hit the right mouse button to complete the line. And you'll create several of those wherever you can find vertical and horizontal features. Obviously, this is grid paper, so they're all over the place. There's an occasional bug where it will actually try to zigzag the lines between. You can delete last point and delete last line, but if that keeps happening, after every line, you want to turn drawing mode off and then back on again, and that seems to fix the problem if that comes up for you. All right, I've gone ahead and done that in a previous lens distortion, and this is what I've got. Several lines representing the basic areas of the grid, indicating the bowing at the outside. And so the lens distortion node can use that to remove the distortion, as you can see here in the final shot. Okay, so we're going to use that lens distortion to kick off our render. Let's go ahead first of all and apply this to the grade. I guess we can apply it after our roto. It doesn't make any difference. And this is the after, this is the before. So you can see how much distortion's been removed by this process. So without further ado, let's add our camera tracker and take a look at the lens tab. In the lens tab, we get to choose either no lens distortion, which obviously is never the case with footage, known lens, refined known lens, or unknown lens. A good choice is to choose refined known lens and then feed in this grid. So if there are any inaccuracies, that will help it hone in on a final solution, but it won't actually force it to use this grid if I've been a little inaccurate in my analysis. So I'm simply going to double click the lens distortion, go to the lens distortion tab, and just drag those radial distortion values down to copy them over. and I'll also drag the distortion center down like so. So now my camera tracker is using the same distortion as the lens distortion. The one thing I need to do is check undistort input at the bottom of the camera trackers tab here, and now you'll see if I toggle between these, they're identical in the distortion removal. But we now have Nuke being told to refine this lens distortion if it finds a better fit. Alright, let's go to the tracking tab, turn on preview features, and we'll set our feature number up to something nice and large. Set it to 450. And that gives us lots of points. The detect threshold and feature separation will be just fine for this. And then in the solver tab, we actually know the lens. This was a 17mm lens. And we don't know the film back size, but it's a Canon 7D. So I'll just go in here and type in Google Canon 7D sensor size. And right here, we have someone who's given us a sensor size at 22.3 by 14.9. Now this is not the 16:9 aspect ratio, so we want to take the 22.3. We'll punch that in here. It is in millimeters. And then we'll do 22.3 divided by 16 times 9 to get the height that would match that. Now technically, this probably scales up a tiny bit compared to the actual backing size, but we'll just leave those values there and say that that's known. And now we're ready to track. So we'll just go ahead and turn the mask to source alpha, make sure it's working. Remember, that's our rotoplanar track that we did before. And we're going to go ahead and track features. Oh, before I do that, I'm going to cancel. To save yourself a lot of time, go ahead and pause the viewer before you run the track, and that will actually speed things up fairly dramatically. The automated tracks have completed, but before we move on, what we'll do is actually apply some of our own manual tracks. So I'm just going to add a tracker node, and as it turns out, I actually on the set, I should unpause the viewer now, we're back. I actually recorded the distance on set between these two grates, this one here and this one here. So I want to get a track of those two items that we can run through the shot for a solve. Let me just clear all of this out, double click the tracker, and we'll go ahead and apply these guys. Track 1, track 2. Let's push this in. I'll set it up in the ground plane and then align from there. You know what? I really need to look for something that doesn't have a lot of motion blur. Right about in there. Looks like a treat. Line it up to the center here. Ground plane. Should be good there. Let's do the same on the other side. Make sure we got it centered. Just crank the gamma so I can see the center grill there. We'll do the same. Give this a little bit of context at the top. And now we'll just track this both ways. I'm at frame 179, I'll track back first and then track forwards. Oh, and yet another track that I'm canceling. Cancel. Let's go ahead and set the warp type to a fine because we're going to expect a little bit of shifting in perspective of those grates. Now the manual tracker completed, but if you remember, we've actually looped our footage. So actually right after frame 195, we're just doubling up the data. We don't really need that. We just want the coverage there for the camera tracker to solve. So 195, I'm going to go there. I'm going to go click clear forward to make sure it doesn't pick up any extra frames there and solve. And now we're going to add those to the automatic tracks that the camera tracker has already done. So double click the camera tracker, go to the tracking tab, and we can just click add user track twice. Now a mistake that you'd be very forgiven for making is going into the animation menu and choosing link to tracker 1, track 1, and adding the data that way. Seems like a very sensible thing to do so you can change your tracking data later. Unfortunately, it just doesn't work. You actually have to have the keyframes in there for Nuke to pay attention to them. I'm assuming that's a bug, not a feature, but that is the way it is. So we're going to shift drag tracker 1 and tracker 2 to the user track 0 and 1 that I just generated by clicking the add user track button. And we'll blow away our existing tracker. So we now have our user tracks and all of the natural tracking data, the automatic tracking data I should say. And the one place we do want to check is frame 519 to 520 to see how the trackers handle it. And you can see that sharp line there, but you'll see that the trackers do make the connection between those two pieces of footage. If you look at features, it's correctly aligned them between that jump. So it looks like a marriage of the two footage elements has been successful. So I will version up and we'll go ahead and solve for the camera. Alright, we got a pretty decent solve error of 1.4. Decent max track error, max error. First thing I want to point out is that if you go to the lens tab, those values have been adjusted. So it started with the lens distortion that we worked out using our grid, and then it's adjusted those. So let's have a look at the original lens distortion and the new lens distortion. Not hugely different, so that's a good sign that our guess was correct in the first place, but enough that it's worth making the change. And so just to be accurate in everything we do, we'll create another lens distortion and we'll call this refined lens distort. And we'll go to the lens distortion tab there and actually take the lens distortion settings from the camera tracker and bring them in here so that we actually have a lens distortion node that mirrors the values. We'll select undistort, and now if we connect that to the footage, we should find that it has the same distortion settings as the camera tracker, and it does. You can see the subtle difference between the original lens distortion here in the edges. Alright, so we now have our camera tracker. We're going to refine the data. A couple of things that we haven't looked at yet, and that is that you can actually select the error track and max track error items, hit the F key to fit, and then you can actually pull your max track error. Oops, wrong one. Oh, we're looking at error track. Pull your error track down to eliminate certain spurious data. And I'll just put that back up for the moment. In fact, I'll just undo. Likewise, you can go to error max and max error and pull the max error down to kill off data beyond a certain point. In a shot like this, it's probably more useful though to pay attention to what's happening in your viewer. What you don't want is to just end up with tracks that only represent the area around the feet of Michaela here. You want it to include some of the areas in the background. If we lose too many of these background tracks, we're not going to get a very representative solve. So let's see how our manual tracks did. If we pop back to the earlier frames, you'll actually see they didn't make it. They actually didn't get included in the solve because of their values. And so we'll live with that for now. Ideally, it would have been nice to use those to define the distances, but we can actually use neighboring tracks to get roughed in anyway. Let's go ahead and do some refining. So we'll refine these values here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pay attention to, as I drag these down, how many of these trackers get eliminated and from where. I'll put the max track error to 2. And I'll pull the max error down to around about 4.5, 4.4. And I want to take a look and make sure there's plenty of representative items from different parts of the shot. And I'll version up, or should do this when you're about to delete. And in this case, we're actually going to delete rejected, which we didn't do last time. And what that does in a more complex solve like this is it will kill off everything. So now, instead of clicking recalculate solve, we'll click solve again. And before we do that, let's go back to our lens. We're happy that it's refined now, so we'll just leave that at known lens so it doesn't try to do it again. It should also be faster. And so now that we've deleted, we have to resolve, but we've deleted the ones that were causing problems for the solve, so it should come up with a better solve this time. Okay, the values are now way down, but you'll see that all of these values of the back fence no longer got included in the final solve. And that's actually not good because it's going to reduce the accuracy of things. We do have one left here, but all of these other ones didn't get included with the final version. They weren't part of the final solve. So I'm actually going to revert back to the previous version. Don't restore the autosave. And instead we'll just mess with the refine track. So at 1.4, we'll do a recalculate solve at these new values. And so with a bit of jiggering of the values, I managed to get the solve error down to 0.865, which I'm pretty happy with. We'll leave it there. And the other thing I've just done is versioned up, but then I deleted the unsolved and deleted the rejected to make sure I'm only working with the clean points. And I still have some values up the back to work with, and that's good. All right, so we'll set a ground plane, and we'll just go somewhere in the middle of our sequence. Remember, our sequence runs from about 625 down to about 780, so around about 700. We'll define a ground plane. Drag select through some of these, right click ground plane, set to selected. And let's tab in and take a look. Now this is actually being positioned upside down, but we'll work with it for now. And let's go ahead and create a camera. Create scene. Here we've got our scene. And we now have a camera that is moving through the shot correctly. And if we actually look through the camera, we'll find that for the most part, all those tracks worked really nicely. We have a few strays up the front here, right in here, but the rest pretty much locked to where they should be. So all is well. Okay. The next job is to actually create the geometry for the set. First thing we're going to do is double click our camera and bring it up in the curve editor. And let's take a look at the Y translation. Now the camera was filmed pretty much at the same distance from Michaela throughout the whole shot, and so what we're seeing mainly is vertical translation. And we can see the 3 dips. We can see the first one where the camera comes down. I should say comes up, starts high and moves. And then this is our actual move over here, the actual final move. So if we go about halfway through the move, let's say around here, we can read that the Y translate value is minus 3.16. Minus 0.316. So we can try and find the same value, the same height off the ground back here, and that'll be minus 0.312 at frame 50. So frame 50 in our clean plate sequence will correspond to frame 691 in our final sequence. And this is why it's important. We're going to add a modeler node. Remember I said earlier that the ground plane as a straight plane probably won't work really well because this is not an evenly flat road. There's actually slope going to the left and the right of the road down towards the curbs. So let's hook up the modeler node to the camera and the source to our refine lens distortion. So we're actually looking through the refine lens distortion. And I'm going to split my properties, add myself a 3D viewer here. You'll see the camera is indeed upside down, which will be fine. Just our world will be inverted. In fact, if we want to do that, we should be able to rotate around the x-axis. Let's just pop in the camera tracker. Go to the scene. And there we go. Rotated in X by 180 degrees. Whoops. Now the scene's right way up. We need to do that before we do any modeling, otherwise that will confuse things. Alright, so we have our modeler up. I'll close out those properties for a moment, and then double click just the modeler. And let's start at our frame 691, and here's how we're going to work with this. We want to find features that allow us to create triangles to basically tessellate out the area that we're going to clean plate. And we have down here some leaves on the road and a marker here. So I have no idea if that leaf is going to move. I'm going to avoid trying to use that leaf. And I'm going to select my Add Faces tool. I'll start with the center of this blue cross. And I will go to the lower left of this yellow reflector. And we want to make triangles as much as possible because they'll be easier to work with in the modeler tool. Click here and then click back on the first point. So I've got that 691, and I said that I want to move between 691 and the clean plate version of 691 is frame 50. So I'll jump there, and I will realign these. Actually, technically, even though we're going to frame, we're going to align with frame 50, there's not really a significant amount of shift between those. So let's try and find a frame that has a bit more dramatic difference in lift. Let's go to say here, frame 116, just so there's more of a perspective difference to help the modeler to calculate space best. And that in the lower left corner. And we want to align this to the edge of the shadow. Let's see how we did. It's a little off. There we go. Yep. And that's actually tracking through pretty nicely. It starts to come unhinged up here towards the end, which is okay because we'll probably be done with our shot by then. But let's go to say frame 785 and do a realignment. Fortunately, we can't access the cross because it's gone off screen by then. And it still seems to be tracking pretty well everywhere else. Go back to 691, and now that we have our first triangle, we're going to extend beyond it. So the next triangle I'm going to build is, I'll start by adding face, click back on my first point, and I'll find the tip of this letter here, which is an H in school, and I'll use maybe the lower left of this reflector, click back like so, and now we'll go back to our magic 116 frame. That's not going to be any good because we can't actually see the tip of the H. We can write there at frame 88. Go ahead and move that back to the tip. In our 3D viewer, let's take a look. See how things are coming. Whoops. I keep just the wrong thing. And obviously something's gone horribly wrong with this one. So I'm going to back up and delete this face. And then I'll select this vertex and delete the vertex. And instead, we'll build off the existing face. Delete that vertex too, which is a much safer way of going. 691 is our start point. That way we only have to add one point at a time. We can build off the surface normal of the first one. So we're going to select these two vertices again, and we'll still push in, select this guy. But now we've only added one new point. So now if I go back, there we go. That's better. Now I can adjust and actually see in the 3D view how things are coming. It looks like we'll need to make some more adjustments there in a moment. There we go. Just setting and making additional keyframes as needed through the rest of the shot. And we're going to continue in this process. So we'll come in here, we'll add another face. I'll pick that little middle of that little speck there. Add another triangle, like so. We're going to continue to adjust this, and I will come back with a finished result. So here's a completed model of the ground. As you can see, it looks kind of funky in the 3D view, but it's just a collection of triangles all knitted together to create one ground plane that hopefully factors in some of the arching that takes place in the ground. So how do we actually use this? Well, this is the fun part. Now we're going to add a project 3D. We'll use a copy of the camera. In fact, we'll copy and paste that camera, pop it in here as camera 2. So that's projecting the scene onto our geometry. I can pull this loose, and now we'll add a scanline renderer, and we'll actually render it using the scene camera. So if I look at it, nothing's changed. Make sure, by the way, that auto alpha is activated in your read node so that it has an alpha channel, which now it does. And it shouldn't look much different right now from the original shot, apart from the fact that obviously it's been trimmed. Let's make sure our full size format is set to 1080p. And there it is. So how do we actually use this for something useful? Let's take a look. After the lens distortion, I'm going to add a time offset node, and I'll just rename it to 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 make it easier to type. And in this new camera, which is currently just a direct duplicate of the original, I'm going to double click it, and in its translate, I'm going to edit the expression, and I'm going to put in parentheses frame, which will give you the value at the current frame. In other words, nothing would change. But then I'm going to do minus TO dot frame underscore offset. Not frame, time underscore offset. Again, nothing's changed yet because the time offset in TO is set to 0. But I'm going to set that up, copy and paste it to all 3 translate channels and all 3 rotate channels. That will cause those translates and rotates to take their current value from whichever frame is specified in the parentheses. Currently, the current frame minus time offset, which is 0, so it will just be the current frame value. But now, if I change this, not only will I be time offsetting the footage being projected, but I'll also change the frame of the camera that's projecting it. And so I can actually project onto the geometry from a different frame, but film the geometry from the current frame's camera. Let's take a look, and then I'll switch to the 3D view to see if it makes more sense there. So if I start moving down, you'll see the footage here is moving, but because we're filming with the current frame's camera, the position of the geometry isn't changing, and therefore, apart from a little bit of skewing here, the footage appears to stay exactly where it is, even though we're actually moving through the shot. So the camera that's projecting is changing. That's camera 2. It's changing position. But the camera that's filming or re-rendering the 3D view through the scanline renderer is our current frame camera. Set it back to 0. And let's actually just merge this back over the shot. Make sure it's before the time offset. So at 0, obviously we see no difference. But as we move forward to future frames, we'll see that the area that we're comping is allowed to move. Now we're going to do something far more extreme. Right now we're moving forward in time to a time when the camera has moved up above the shot. But let's move to our clean plate frames. And we said that that was between 691 and 50. So when we're at frame 691, it should correspond to frame 50 back at the earlier part of our timeline where our clean plate is. Right here. So going into our time offset, 691 minus 50, 641. And this is what we get. We're getting the frame 50, or actually if I should be at 691 to prove that. Frame 691, frame 50 is replacing the ground. So this is the original shot, this is the replacement. Obviously it's not perfect and we'll have to do some matting, but we've basically done an entire ground replacement, and as we step through, you'll see that because the current frame camera is refilming whatever was at frame 50, but from the frame 680 or so vantage point, everything moves smoothly with the background. And Michaela is essentially removed from the shot. Now, as we get closer to the start, we'll see Michaela's head poking out the top there. But that's okay, because actually we won't start our effects shot until around about frame 675. And at that point, it's okay that she get removed. So we still need to tidy up some of the edges. We could do a quick blur fix. Trying to get unpremult, blur the matte, erode the matte, and then repremult at the back end. And now with my dilate, I can shrink. With my blur, I can soften the transition border. And now we have a much more natural blend between the clean plate and the original shot. Obviously, we need to actually create a custom matte, which would be easy to do for our shot, so that we can isolate and adjust how the different edges are comped back in. But you'll see that we've basically removed Michaela from the shot. We'll clean this up. In fact, that can be homework, and obviously I'll have it cleaned up for the next shot, ready for our final effect, which we'll do in the next class, where we cause Michaela to collapse like cloth. Feel free to ask me questions in the forum. My finished solution was 05 Geo added, so if you want to play with the final shot, pull that one up.